Morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Hey, Mallory. Hey, Lars. Are you there? Okay. So let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the Hmoo working group at IETF 112. Glad to talk to you all again. I was a little bit surprised to not see too many agenda requests for the hybrid stuff since we're trying to bring that into the scope for the working group with the recharting discussions, but we unfortunately we didn't get anything there. So just like keep an eye out like for the recharting to bring the hybrid stuff into scope. That's part of like the end of the discussion today to just show you what are the things that are changed in the charter, what people have proposed, and we can continue from there. Ali, can you go to the next slide? This is the regular note. Well, like you've seen it all. Probably it's Friday morning, so you've probably seen it like too many times this week to be happy about. There's like this is a summary of the IPR stuff for the IETF. Like the RFCs in question are like 5378 and 8179. So please consult the RFCs for more details. Next slide. So if you're looking for a minute taker, if there's any volunteers to do so. Ron, you've been awesome until now, so if you can do it, I don't know if you would turn up today or not because it's like I know it's very late for you. So if it's something you can do, greatly appreciate it. Okay, okay. Thanks, Mallory. Thanks for picking it up. And if anybody else can also help out Mallory if she gets into some discussions or something, please. Thank you very much. Thanks. So we next slide. So the actually I think there's like some version of the slide. I think I didn't make a change here. Anyway, the remote meetings has been published already, and the remote fee draft is like pending change of status. Like it's supposed to change into a BCP, and that's like going to be part of the discussions today to change the charter to make this a BCP. And we had a leadership change like between the last meeting and this meeting. Amelia decided she had like some change in circumstances in her work and like she couldn't dedicate enough time for this. So Mallory came on board. So thank you, Mallory, for stepping up and doing this job. And thanks, Amelia, for the stuff you've done for us already. Thank you. Next slide. And so the Charles's draft, running the IETF hackathon, it's like completed like the working group last call. There was like a whole bunch of comments that came in, and Charles addressed them. He's going to summarize like what is changed in the draft today, and also the draft Skillowin online meeting. So that's like Miriam and Martin like are going to summarize like what has happened on the draft, and that should be something we should hope to adopt in this deliverable. And we haven't seen anything pretty much on the functional requirements for technologies other than the hum draft. I haven't seen much like in this thing. So I think this is like going to be something that's going to come off the charter if like Lars so approves, right? Because we haven't seen any drafts for this like in the whole time we've been around. So next slide. So we have two presentations today. It's like a pretty short agenda. So we're not going to cut the mic if at all possible, unless it really runs into the whole 2 hours. It's pretty much like Martin and Miria is going to present first. for the online meeting organization draft. And then Charles is going to summarize the changes to the hackathon draft that have happened after a working group last call. And then we're going to like push far along with it. Like Mallory is going to be shepherding the document through, and we'll move further. And the recharter, so what like we've done is like Mallory and I have gone through all the comments that came in during the recharter proposal. And so we made like all the edits that are required. So I think the last one came in from Miria to address like a comment Michael Richardson made, and that has been accommodated. I think it was a couple of days ago that Miria put in. So after that, we haven't seen any changes. So we have pretty much like included all the changes in there. And I'm going to send a mail to the working group mailing list with all the kind of changes, because it's done in a Google Doc. It's kind of very hard to like do all the like diffs in there, but I can actually run through the stuff at the end of the meeting to actually walk through the document and just show you what has changed. And then at some point we need to ship it off to Lars, because it's something like I hadn't appreciated very much, but the recharter doesn't happen until we have a charter to put up. So there's no way to put something up as a chair to do it, other than going to the AD and asking them to put up a straw man in there. So the goal would be after like a reasonable cool-off time after all the changes are resolved now, to ship it off to Lars to kick off the recharter process. Lars, any comments there?
Hey, yeah, not really. So I was waiting for the last bullet point there, but since you mentioned it, so I'm actually totally fine of having a small charter, right? If there's work items that the group has sort of lost energy on, I don't see that as a failure. I think I see that as a chance to eliminate some things. So nobody should like feel that they need to write a draft just because we have like a work item that hasn't been seen in action for a couple of years, right? If we're okay with dropping it, I'm okay with dropping it. I'd much rather give guidance that's actually going to be helpful.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Lars. Thank you. So, is there any other comments on the agenda itself? If not, let's switch to Martin and Miria. So we don't have any slides from you. Did I get that right, Martin or Miria?
Just approve their slides in the data tracker, and they're loaded into Meet after now.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
Martin, if you'd like to drive, go ahead.
All right. Okay. I think the hackathon draft is loaded twice. At least that's what I'm seeing. Try again.
I can see the slides, right?
So there.
Okay.
They're
Data
processing.
tracker.
They've been processing for a while, so I don't know if that's because they're really large. You can also do a screen share if you'd rather. So yeah, I processed them immediately, but they're still showing for me as processing. So it could just be the file is large or something.
Okay. I have a sharing request up that I think needs approval.
Done it. Yeah.
It's not showing up. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. I think it's probably more productive at this point.
I think it's starting.
Oops.
Martin. I can see it saying screen share is being started, but nothing coming through yet.
All right, can everyone see that?
It's coming
That's
through.
great.
Yes.
Okay, I see the comments. Great, thank you. So the purpose, this draft that Mira and I wrote, it's just about, kind of how you set up an online meeting. It's kind of just a guide to all of those things, and it covers a lot of the, for lack of a better word, traditions we developed over the past year and a half. I don't think any of this would be a big surprise to anyone. You can look at it. We've not much of this has not changed. The one thing that really has changed is time zone selection. So after a lot of discussion 1 or 2 meetings ago, we settled on, I thought there was pretty good consensus in the room for any given meeting, not optimize for a particular time zone, but try to optimize for 2 time zones, so that in any given 3 meeting rotation, one of the like official regions would only really have an awful meeting slot once per year. So what that means is that rather than having like a North America time slot and an Asia time slot and a Europe time slot, there's a night time slot for each of those. So this is the one where that suffers. And then the other 2 regions, one is like having one start about breakfast and having one start the other one. And the third one is having the meeting start about dinner time or so. And then like the truly graveyard shift hours are only happen once a year. So you can see those times. I'm going to talk a little bit about the scoring in a minute, but we did mention before like a sort of a scoring system for various time zones and the hours in which a given UTC start time would occur. And after some messing around with that, these are the times we came up with and what are currently in the draft. We did make the step of separating out northern summer and northern winter, because obviously daylight savings has an impact on what's optimal. Once we moved to this night-based concept, we also had to revise the rules for selection. So that table there, which is in the draft in the lower right, is a very complicated way of saying that basically whatever time zone had a fairly favorable time slot before, like you're the one that's going to be in the night if it's an online meeting. And it kind of covers all the permutations of having previous online meetings or in-person meetings according to this framework. So it's just an algorithm that tells you how to pick the time slot for a remote meeting that might not be tied to a physical location that got canceled. It could just be a deliberate online meeting. So that, that's one of the things we had to work around. Okay, this is the final scoring system, or at least current scoring system, I should say. So maybe and I talked about this a little bit, and we assigned kind of pain points for hours, 01 to 05 being the worst, and then kind of the one shoulder hour there are 2 points. And then each one of those time zones had a median score among the 3 meetings per year. So this is the second worst time zone, and this is what we're trying to minimize. So there's one time slot of the 3 where you're just going to get it's going to be very inconvenient. And then if we can make the second one painless according to the scoring system, that's a pretty good outcome, or comes close to that as we can do. For Asia, we just took Sydney, Japan, China, and India as sort of, I think it's just a sort of sample of representative time zones that are relevant to IETF. And we took the medians for each of those time zones and did a simple mean of those 4. India is really quite an outlier in terms of times relative to, because it's kind of, as everyone knows, is kind of between or East Asia and Europe. So that turns out to be a little odd in terms of scoring, but nevertheless, that's what we did. With Europe, we just use CET. Of course, there's fewer time zones in Europe than most other places. And then in North America, we just took the Eastern and Pacific time zones and just did a simple mean of those 2 to minimize that. So you might be wondering what those slots mean for you. We've done the math for you here. So given what we now have in the draft for UTC times, this is what it means for you. Or at least you can figure out what it means for you based on the time zones you see here. Give you a minute to look at that. And that's that. There's no other changes since my last talk on this. Mira, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, there were a few more changes, but most of them were actually structural and editorial, and then there was a little bit more discussion added based on the
Okay.
discussion we had the last
I guess she
meeting.
has nothing to add unless my audio is broken. So I guess the question is this ready for adoption, or are people not happy with the general direction of this draft?
I think Miria did say something. So we could hear her.
Okay, I'm apparently having some audio problems, and I'm not hearing things. To answer the question in the chat, the 112 meeting does not fall into these slots. In one of these slots, the ISG's sort of emergent habit has been to schedule it at 1200 or 1300 local time, in the absence of any sort of consensus document. So I'm fairly optimistic the 113 will be in person in some sense, but if for some reason it isn't, and if this moves quickly, we might use this as a framework instead of the existing tradition. Can people not hear me? Oh, my audio output, right? Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on. All right, great. I'll answer the questions in the chat since I can't seem to hear anybody for some reason. Just tell me in the chat if I need to be quiet because someone else is talking. Thoughts on hybrid timing? This draft doesn't really address that. I think in practice, we will have to at least do it during the day of the host venue for no reason for the actual support staff to be able to do that. As for what specific time of day it will be, like there've been no discussions about that, and this draft is not on that topic at all.
Miria, since you got cut off, did you want to come back, make your point? And thank you.
Yeah, I don't think I got much.
Okay, I'm gonna attempt to exit Meet Echo and come back in because this is not working, but I can't hear anybody. So just give me a moment, please.
Yep. Hey. Yeah, then let me talk for a second. So this draft had some more editorial changes, a little bit of restructuring, and there's a new section on some considerations about how to use the online time now flexible, because we don't necessarily have to squeeze everything into 1 week, but it doesn't give a clear recommendation. It's just a discussion about what the options are. So that's the other thing that was added. Martin, can you hear us now?
Restarting always works. Sorry about that.
Hey, no worries. Hey, Miria, just a quick question for you, but like not related to the Hmoo itself, right? But like this experiment of the 2-week thing, are you planning to have some kind of survey or something afterwards to figure out from the people what they thought? Is that the plan?
I mean, Martin could answer this as well because he wrote the text about the experiment. I think the email is very clear that we have some evaluation criteria there. And so there is a survey included. There's some data we want to look at, and we will send out this evaluation after the meeting for more discussion. I mean, and probably also to the many coaches list or to the Hmoo list, but like not necessarily only because there was an IETF-wide experiment. So I assume the discussion will happen also on an IETF-wide mailing list. I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Alex, go ahead.
Question about
whether you hear me.
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Okay, I have no camera. Yeah, so the question was whether this direction of considering 4 slots instead of 3 slots has been considered.
You mean 4 slots per year or per day, or in which context?
No. Okay, so there is a number 3 in this in this draft, right? So instead of 3, to make it 4.
Well, so there are three. The RFC number, which 79 something, I can't remember, all of a sudden specifies 3 regions in which we consider hosting meetings: Asia, Europe, and North America. And our intent here in this system is to keep a fair balance between those 3 regions. So I was a little verbally sloppy in assuming that there were 3 meetings per year. In principle, you could have any number of meetings per year and still use this algorithm. But the point is to balance the time zone pane across the 3 regions listed in that RFC.
Okay, to clarify myself, 3 meetings per year, but cycling through 4 time zones, not time slots, but time zones. Okay.
So we did not consider that beyond the observation that there's an IETF consensus document that we should attempt to balance across the 3 regions listed. And so that's what we sought to do. If we did 4, by definition, it wouldn't evenly balance those considerations.
Okay. Okay, there are regions and there are time zones. Okay, some of the regions have more time zones than others. So my question whether these, so for example, Asia has more time zones than the other.
We only took the median of the time zones. So it's not that they get weighted more because there are more time zones considered. It's just like the range of time zones we consider for each region. But we rate each region equally. So it's only 3 values that go in the calculation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So. Yeah. Okay.
Ted, go ahead.
To the slide and maybe just walk us through the chart that you did, because I don't actually know how to read the chart. I could probably sit down and figure it out over, I could spend 15 minutes trying to reverse engineer it, but it would be nice if you guys, since you already know how it works, could just sort of explain it to us.
Sure. Sorry, I have to share my thing again. There we go. Okay. So again, in the draft, there are 3 slots per season listed. So that's on the far left here. You have, the UTC times that are on the previous slide. And then for any given time zone, if any meeting that is in the northern winter. So take the example of CET. So in the northern winter, a meeting would start at either 7 o'clock local time, 3 p.m. local time, or 11 p.m. local time. In the northern summer, CET meetings would start at 7 o'clock, 3 p.m. or midnight local time. Does that make it clearer? So I mean, so I think the takeaway from this is that one meeting, assuming there are 3 meetings per year, that one of those meetings will be essentially in the middle of the night, and the other ones will be relatively, not like right in the middle of the workday, but during the hours people are usually awake.
Thanks.
Does that help?
A little bootstrapping.
Okay. Andrew?
I just sort of picking up the discussion from the chat. I think for scoring purposes, you could conceivably, just responding to the point from Alex earlier, alternate the Asia Pac time zone. So rather than taking a median, because it is so wide, you could conceivably alternate between, say, India and I mean, I'm just putting in the chat maybe Japan, but I mean, you could pick randomly a different place on the other side, towards the other side of the region. But I think the reality is, having said that, you're going to kind of end up with some variation of 3 start times, roughly 8 hours apart. I suspect whatever algorithm you use, so you could make the scoring more sophisticated, but I'm not sure you actually end up with any better answer than you have, because it's going to have to share the pain somehow.
Yeah, we've certainly played with it a little bit. I don't. If someone has a very compelling case that a particular scoring system, other than what we did, is absolutely the right way to do this, then I'd be open to that. But just tinkering with this is not going to get us very far. It is an interesting idea to say that we have what I think is in the chat, and there's a theme here that maybe when we do well, I'm not sure how it would work actually. I guess if in the North America night and the Europe night slots, if the Asian slot maybe sometimes tried to minimize the pain for India and sometimes tried to minimize the pain for Japan, that is a little bit hard to work through. But if there's a strong consensus that we should do that, I think we could probably work out something in that.
So I think you can make the scoring scheme as complicated as you want. You can add more stuff and so on. I'm not sure if the result would change from that. As I said, the optimization criteria is really to only have one slot that is really bad, which means the other 2 slots are probably doable, but also not the best slot you can get. That's the main criteria. And like for yourself, I think you should look at what time zone you are in and if the times for you are somehow acceptable. And that's also what we did. And like we found, and this what we suggest seems to be for all time zones. We considered that the slots seem to be acceptable. There's one thing about India might suffer slightly more than the other time zones, but there's no perfect solution.
Well, so I do want to I think it's a little more subtle than that. India is experiencing something more like a lot of us are experiencing during this current tempo, which is that there are 2 slots that are kind of bad. So there's one where you go to bed at 2, and we could look at the slide presentation again, but there are 2 moderately painful slots instead of 1 that's horrible, and then the other two are fine. So, Asia's big, as you may not know, yeah. And this is a hard problem, but that's kind of where we ended up.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, Maria. So, so you folks think it's ready for the draft is ready for adoption? Okay.
I think so. I mean, we can certainly I'm open to another discussion about maybe doing something creative with the breadth of Asia, as long as it's kind of done within Asia and doesn't mess the balance between the 3 regions. I think that would be perfectly fine. But how that works is not obvious, and that would require discussion. But that shouldn't block adoption, in my view.
Yeah, so that can be part of the working group process, Martin, right? If we decide to do something. So so what we can do is we can get a adoption call kicked off next week. I think it's we've seen generally positive stuff, but I'm sure there's other stuff that's going to come up. So we can handle it during the working group stages of the draft. If that's okay.
Yeah. Oh, and just for people's information, so the India time slots are 11 in the morning to 5 p.m., which is the best one, 7 p.m. to 1 a.m., which is pretty bad, and then 3 a.m. to 9 a.m., which in my view is really bad. But I mean, you can sort of see the dynamics of that. It's not quite an overnight shift.
And I would like to reply to this idea of having 4 time slots, which are each 5 hours apart. I don't think that will solve the problem, because that just means that you have to suffer in more of these time slots. So currently we have 3 time slots. So hopefully you wherever you are have to only suffer really badly for 1 of them instead of for 2 or more. That's the goal here. I don't think adding more time slot will make it better. I mean, if there's another proposal, I'm happy to consider it. But we have been thinking about this so much, and really check your time zone and see if this is acceptable for you, and let's move on.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to change the topic a little bit to there wasn't as much advice in this draft, and it has been a sort of active question on sort of attendee list about how to handle socializing among IETF participants. That I don't know what it is like for other people. I feel like I'm still struggling with that. I haven't always made it to the gather things. I'm not quite sure how to use it. Should we in this draft or sometime soon like provide some recommendations about what to do?
The draft does mention that there is a little bit of a trade-off between online meetings are more open. It's more easier to participate in general in the meeting, but you're missing out the social component. So there is a discussion about this, and the draft generally encourages people to experiment with things. But I don't have a good solution. I don't have a great proposal, so I don't know what else to add to the draft. But proposals are welcome.
I mean, we could, if somebody would want to suggest some text that kind of hints at a Gather-like space, I'm perfectly open to that. I do think there are fundamental limitations when you're at home, when it might be a bad time zone, or there are other things. I think it's harder to get people to just go socialize because they have other things to do. Whereas when you're at the hotel, you have nothing to do but go interact with your fellow attendees. It's probably a fundamental limitation in my view, but yeah, I think if there's any sort of tooling, I'm not opposed to having a section in the draft, but I'm not sure what that would say.
To be clear, I agree that it's hard. I wasn't saying, oh, this is easy, you should answer it. But
yeah.
But I also sort of wonder if like maybe we should say like it is going to be hard and we should try to force it a little bit because otherwise people won't do it.
Yeah, I think it's one thing to say like, hey, we need to have a mechanism, and the other one is to force. Like I think I have the same problem like Media was stating, right? Like it's the when something is online and offset from your time zone, it's going to be very hard to find the time. So I greatly appreciate some text input there, Nick. Thank you.
Yeah, so as I said, there is text saying socializing is a problem. We see this because zero drafts, for example, going down, and the text currently says this should be considered, right? It doesn't say more than that.
Yeah.
So look at section 4.3, and if you have additional wording, please propose it.
Yeah, thanks. Lars, go ahead.
Yeah, 2 points on that same point that Nick raised. So I on this meeting and also with last meetings, for me personally, the half-hour breaks are sort of too short and too long at the same time, in some sense that they're long enough that I do some other things, but then I don't have time to hang out or gather. If it's a 15-minute break, I think I'm sort of more happy to drop in, but this is sort of the worst of both worlds. So I'm kind of wondering if we should sort of, as an option, describe having an 1 hour break at some point during that meeting, so that you can eat something and then still have some time for gather. For those of us who don't like to eat in front of the screen. But that's sort of just a minor suggestion. The other thing I wanted to suggest is a little bit.
Can I ask
Sure.
Clarifying question? So are you proposing then, because the draft also says we shouldn't extend the day more than 6 hours. So are you proposing to actually extend the day or just using?
Well, I guess it would have to be extended because I don't think we can eat into the working time. And I totally get the trade-off here, right? If you're in the middle of the night, a 1 hour break is pretty useless. But if you're not, it's sort of quite helpful. But there's no, as somebody said in the chat, right? There's no good solutions here.
Yeah, and also the draft doesn't give like a clear rule that you have to follow. It says this is what we did so far. Here are the trade-offs. Yeah. Please experiment in future with it. So,
and
I'm
that's
happy
fine.
to write something else in the draft if there's consensus. But that's what the draft is currently saying.
The other thing I think I wanted to sort of bring up is that this is about fully online meetings, and we're hopefully going to go towards hybrid meetings. So people should think a little bit about. And maybe discuss it on the mailing list. What guidance we want to give, guidance like this for hybrid meetings. So for example, do we want to stick to this rotation or use this algorithm to schedule the working group sessions during the day for a hybrid meeting? Do we want to do the start at lunch thing? Do we want to think about having some flexibility in terms of catering to the people on site, but also not making it terrible needlessly for people elsewhere? What do we want to do in terms of the length of the day? Are we okay with going slightly longer for working group sessions or not? So I think those sorts of things are what would be really helpful to see some community input on the list on, specifically as we go towards 113, where hopefully we would have an in-person participation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Lars. Pete?
wait for the magic to happen. Yes, I mentioned in the chat room, and I think it might be worth saying something along these lines in the document, that my use for the past 2 meetings has been for Gather to be the sort of home base for me. And I use the little doors to go into the sessions and to meet Echo, and maybe some mention of experimenting around the idea of having the social space be the primary space, and you go into the meeting sessions as a potential way to increase the social interactions between sessions and to get people into the habit of switching between rooms, for instance, to check out other sessions, because that's become useful. I can step in and go, oh, no, really not. Or I can step in and say, hey, not something that I normally would go to, but there it is up on the screen, and I've been curious about it, and step into a room. And not specifying Gather, but specifying tools that are around socialization and cross-area interactions in rooms. Something along those lines might be useful to point out as a good part of the experiment.
It does sound a little bit like a tooling consideration. So
It is,
yeah.
and you know, we can't push a particular one in the draft. I don't think that's useful. I think giving the example is possible, but just to sort of center people around the idea of maybe we have to think about the general approach to tooling. Do we want it to be centered around sessions? Do we want it to be centered around social aspects? And maybe more integrate. I thought the integration so far has been really good if you start by using Gather. So some discussion about what we've seen so far.
Yeah, Jay did. We were kicking around at one point the idea of Meet Echo deliberately kicking you into Gather when you left a session. I'm not sure what happened with that, because I know that was an intent. Maybe it just turned out to be a problem for some reason.
Yeah, there was.
But yeah, and I
think Gather as a specific, I think, for that proposal.
Yeah. Anyway,
but nudges like that, I think, are a good idea. I mean, some people really don't like Gather for one reason or another. But it is what it is.
Understood.
I think the Gather platform requirements are a bit tighter than Meet Echo, I think. Like, you know, like there's some stuff where I got Meet Echo to work, but not Gather. So I think that could be like some technical showstopper there, right? Like, you know, that if the you cannot get kicked into Gather.
Well, Jay's in the chat and says he doesn't know what happened to that either. So it might just be an oversight. So maybe we'll fix it just in time for the online meetings to be done.
I kind of remember this. I'm already in the queue, so I'll. I remember it on the list, and so my use case, especially in the IRTF, is we have a lot of day passers and a lot of like invited speakers, and it would create a really unnecessary speed bump because they're already struggling to use the tool for the first time to get on the agenda, to get in the room, and so if you're forcing them into these other things that are out of band for them because they're not trying to socialize, that could be a problem. And so then, of course, you'd have to create an alternative where you could just dip in based on the agenda, and then that's what everybody would use. So you lose that sort of, you know, you're centering everybody because they'll use what works for them, and it probably won't be Gather.
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I don't think any of these considerations belong into this draft actually, because it's really more about tooling. So maybe it would be a separate draft. But if people think something should go into this draft, then please let us know.
I was in the queue for a different point around social stuff that maybe we could say. So one thing that might work well, but would require a bit of decentral organization, we couldn't really prescribe it, we could suggest it. It would also probably require a bit of sponsorship, is to have local meetings like face-to-face, where there are lots of people that live, like in DC, for example, or San Francisco, Paris, or places where you actually do have a community of IETFers that might know each other already because they live in the same town. That could be something to encourage, because I think it actually is quite nice, but only a half measure for sure.
So, I mean, I think this is the original idea that was brought up when the many coaches list was actually created. But the idea never really got so far to the point that people actually organized it. So I would be, I mean, encouraging that is maybe a good idea, but it would be nice to actually see some experience with it.
Mallory, can you send some text suggestions for Miria and Martin if you want to add something there? Like I think Miria's point is good, right? Like, maybe there's something that can go into the draft, and there's like other stuff, like the details, like how to do it might have to go somewhere else, right? I think it would be good if you can just ship it over.
And a really good flag that it was part of the original mini couches idea. You're right. So we can also go back to that and get folks like Dan York and others to chime in. But yeah, I'd be happy to draft something up just as a suggestion in the realm of experimental possibilities, right?
And I see Pete saying that there was a Boston Hub experience. So if anybody was actually at that Boston Hub and could report back, that would be helpful as well.
Thanks,
Okay.
Mallory. I think the Ted is next on the line.
This is the Boston Pub meeting. I went to them pretty religiously while they were happening. They were kind of hard to organize. There was like not quite the right amount of energy to make it happen consistently, and also the fact that it was asynchronous with IETF meant that people had to come up with sort of off IETF presentations, which meant that it was actually a bunch of extra work that you had to do. So I think trying to figure out a way to make those meetings synergize with IETF rather than sort of be additional to IETF might be helpful. And I think, I have to say, I definitely enjoyed getting together with IETF people in the Boston area. There were plenty of people. We had, great socialization. So in that sense, it was good. It's just that the amount of work that was involved in prepping, I gave a couple of presentations and it was like, it was a big hit. So that wasn't my topic though. It's really interesting that Mallory brought that up because I thought it was great, but, had some issues. My topic was,
what would be helpful for me is to understand like how those meetings were actually organized, because I've never been at one, right? Was the meeting during the IETF week? Was it before? What kind of presentations did you have? Did you have a social component on these kind of information would be probably very helpful.
Yeah, so these were interim meetings essentially, except that they weren't working group meetings. They were just like people get together, and the presentations were just so we'd have something to talk about. Like, what are people working on? So doing it sort of at the same time as the IETF might work well, actually, but the problem is that then you need an actual venue. Like, we were basically getting spaces loaned by various companies, and to do that for an entire week would be like pretty hard. So yeah, but I can tell you more offline if you want about what this was like, or I could even go into it in detail here if you feel like we have time and want to do it. But
I was thinking about bringing it to the mailing list probably rather.
Okay. Yeah, so the thing that I wanted to talk about is that you just got a whole bunch of questions that basically boil down to the thing that we're taking off of the charter, which is tooling, right? So basically all of these questions about Meet Echo or whatever the social thing is are really questions about what's the right tool to solve the problem. Or at least I'm going to claim that that's what they're about. And the reason I claim that that's what they're about is that it was really interesting listening to Pete talk about the way that he's engaging with the IETF and contrasting that with the way that I'm engaging with the IETF in these weird times. Because the way I'm engaging with the IETF in these weird times is that IETF meetings have just become new meetings on my schedule. There's no longer an IETF event, except that the week of IETF is like super busy for me because I have so many extra meetings. And that's very different than the way that I engaged with the IETF when I was going to the IETF in person. When I went to the IETF in person, if I had to take a work meeting, that was like a big imposition on my IETF schedule. Now it's exactly the opposite. And I think that, some folks, probably the people who show up for Gather, are trying to continue the experience that they had with in-person IETFs. So like, I miss the things that I got out of the in-person IETF in terms of socialization, but Gather isn't solving that problem for me. The problem with Gather is that I have to go to Gather and I have to be there in order to actually interact with people. And because it's optional and because I've got other stuff going on, it's not the right thing. Like, it would be nice to have a way that we could have sort of impromptu discussions form that that replicates what we did in IETF. In IETF, in-person meetings, the way that the side meetings often formed was sort of by happenstance. You'd walk by somebody and you think, oh, right, I need to talk to them about this thing. We don't have that anymore. And I don't think that Gather really does that, because you kind of have to be able to spend like a bunch of time in Gather to make that work. And it's hard to justify spending that time. So it would be kind of nice if there was like a much lower cost way to be sort of in the same room with everybody, rather than Gather. Like personally, like if Jabber was a little bit more functional, I'd say let's just have a Jabber room that's like where everybody is between sessions. And like
So
if you're doing IETF,
yeah, we do have an IETF Slack channel that is only sparsely used by a subset of people, I think. But the IETF is also working on, or the tools team basically is working on to going away from Jabber and using other chat tools where you have more this kind of channel kind of setup and so on, and it might make it easier to connect to people directly in these kind of things. And so there is work in progress there. I'm not disagreeing with you at all, right? But talking about the charter, I think that the reason why we took off this item from the charter was because in a lot of cases we were just diving into like very low level requirements about, you know, using IP6 or how the button should look like, if it should be green or yellow or whatever. And I think for these low level things, it's not useful to have an RSC. For more high level considerations, requirements, what you are talking about, this might be useful, but we need to think more about it. We need more discussion about it.
yeah. I mean, when I heard that it was being taken off the charter, my immediate reaction was, shit, I should write a draft before it gets taken off the charter, because I actually think it's pretty important. So, you know, in my copious free time.
So,
but
yeah. I'm not sure if, you know, the item we took off the charter was really more about low level requirements. So I think like if you really have this kind of high level requirements about how to improve socializing, this might still be in scope. I mean, check this out, the charter, but the first step is really writing a draft that fosters discussion, and that might help us to make progress.
Yeah, I think the there's like a really bad echo. So I think okay, I think I probably have to call back.
Shall I speak whilst he's going back?
Sure.
Okay. Well, just reflecting on the last conversation, and I get to the 3 points I wanted to make. I think the fundamental problem with the socialization thing remotely is we're all remote, and yeah, you can't do things you would do in socialization, like drink beer, or you can, but drinking beer by yourself is a bit sort of sad and not quite the same. And depending on what time zone you're in, you're maybe not sleeping in order to socialize and so on. So yeah, this may be the wrong venue to say this, but I think actually completely replicating the whole of the in-person experience with a remote meeting is probably impossible. If we're all in different time zones. Yeah, I think it's the wrong thing to try and replicate, because in my view it's not solvable remotely. The other comment, to then just pick up the things I wanted to then cover. Someone posed a question, possibly Martin, about when we go to hybrid meetings, should we use the time zones in this paper? I think that's a horrible thing to do. I think when we go to hybrid meetings, we surely have to use the model of the time zone where the meeting is actually happening in person. Because otherwise, if you think about it, we're asking people to pay extra to be there in person, to have a dumbed down experience to suit the people that aren't there in person. I think that doesn't make a great deal of sense. I think the better thing to do is to try and uplift the remote experience to make it better, rather than limit the in-person experience to make that worse. So I think that needs a different solution to a fully remote meeting. One of the things I've commented on in the chat, but it's probably worth saying, is, and I have no idea how this is going to work, but I note that IGF next month has adopted a hybrid model. As I say, no connection with that, no idea what's planned, but I think that's bound to throw up some interesting observations, good or bad. So there must be some learnings from that that will help guide IETF 113 in different ways. So it's probably quite fortuitous timing. It's happening when it is. And then the other thing, just finally, just by chance, I noted this morning in the news, there was an article about one of the big hotel chains has done a deal with Zoom to facilitate hybrid meetings. So maybe if we go to multiple in-person remote gatherings, if you will, maybe that's something which is going to be more commonplace in future anyway, with at least meaning that conference facilities and so on will be equipped with the right sort of stuff to make that practical. I'm not advocating for Zoom necessarily, but if they got the right kit there, presumably it will work with other tooling as well.
So, Andrew, I think what we really need at this point is having something written down. If you have a concrete proposal of what we should do in a hybrid meeting, then just write it down in a draft, and so we can have some discussion based on some text. Would be really helpful, because we in the IHG, or also in this meeting, have heard many different opinions about different things, right? And it's really hard to come to a conclusion to understand what the community wants. So
yeah,
writing something down would be the first step here.
I'm all things being equal, I hope to be in Poland at IGF next month, so I'll be able to sort of put some reflections from what the in-person experience in the hybrid meeting was. Hopefully there are other people in this group that will be attending remotely, so you can get two halves. But dare I say it, Murder, to put forward a paper, doesn't that need the charter to change first? Because that's out of scope, I think.
Yeah, but I think we have the charter text now, so as soon as that is approved, like, you can start writing the draft now, because it should be approved. Will be approved very soon. And maybe one more point, because you made this point about there should be additional benefits for the in-person people, and then there were comments at the chat that, like, we shouldn't, like, decrease the remote performance or whatever. So this is kind of a very high-level principle where we need to find agreement, right? So far, before the crisis, we said, like, we always want to optimize for in-person, because that's what you pay for and that's what is important. Now we improved remote a lot. We also tried to improve remote before, but not on the cost of in-person meetings. Now we improved remote a lot. Are we willing to take some of this back if it would make in-person bad? Or is there enough benefit already by just going there and socializing that you might also, take some drawbacks for the in-person people? So this is like a high-level principle where I don't think we have community agreement, and some discussion and some proposal would be useful.
Yeah, well, that's why I think
me personally. Go ahead.
So that's why I think IGF might be really helpful, because I think they are, for example, going to have a single mic queue, so that you have to use your device if you're in person to join the mic queue. So there might be some simple adaptations, and personally, I don't see how that detracts from the in-person experience, but then at least makes everyone on an equal footing to have a voice in the room, I would imagine.
I mean, there have also been more extreme proposals where people said, instead of having the whole room set up with a screen and the desk and so on, everybody should just sit with their laptop in a room and participate in this way in the meeting, right? So this is the other extreme. Like, we need to figure out where we want to be.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Dhruv. Michael shamed me to come to the mic when I was talking about the hubs in India. So just wanted to share a quick experience there. When we did it, it was not that successful. I think the main reason was the people who were active in IETF in India were actually in the IETF meeting. So it was kind of very difficult to sort of organize like in a hub meeting at that time. Now, when we go back to the hybrid model, and there are people like, if there is a restriction in India where we are not able to travel because of some reason, then I think going back to the hub model would be a little bit more successful, and we could try that. The issue that we have faced at that time was that people had so varied interest, even in this, some people are interested in routing, some in apps. So how do we organize hubs? Like, we needed 6-7 rooms, and that was a logistical nightmare at that time to do it at a very local, simple level. So we kind of dropped the idea. What we started doing is more meetups. There's something that we called RFCs We Love. We kind of invited people that if you have some ideas, come and talk about what you are doing in IETF, even if something that you have implemented. So we got some implementers who have implemented some RFCs to come and kind of completely open anything that you want to talk. That was quite successful. Still doing on online thing, and we hope to continue to do that. Talking now about the hybrid model, and even what we were talking about with Gather. In my area, what I've seen is I think we need some kind of forcing function, like organize some event, something to make people come there. Because I know so many people I talk to, like Meet Me and Gather, like, oh, I don't have time for that. I have a busy week. I want to go do things. So even if it's some technical, like hot RFC was a pretty good thing that we did in Gather, something like that. Even if working group chairs can organize something, okay, we'll be reviewing this draft, which is next in ISG. So if anybody has any concerns, let's go and meet and force people to use that. I think I see some potential there. It would be good to, we find some ways to make that work. Thank you.
So about the hub experience, I think it would be super, because I have no experience with that, and I'm assuming that you now talk about a hub where there was actually a meeting during the meeting, right? Other talked about hubs where there were pre or side meetings or whatever. So writing down your experience for others to learn from it would be very useful, I think.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Dhruv.
One, I think one of the challenges for me on one of these hub things is as I think other people have said, ultimately you're there, but then everyone goes off in 8 different rooms or just gets on their laptop, which is not awesome. You maybe separating out the plenaries we did this time is an opportunity to gather everyone for a single event. So all the Bay Area people could get together and watch the plenary and then have some socialization. Something like that might work. I don't know. Just a thought.
And are you just coming up as a chair, or?
I was just going to suggest maybe that there's an actual section on hubs. That's maybe where both Dhruv and I could put our text. But anyway, actually, as a chair,
I mean,
I'm
happy to accept a text, but it seems like this is a bigger topic that might need a different document or a separate document.
Could be.
Miriam, thanks. I think Charles, you can come up next.
There are more people in the queue?
No.
So do the chairs want to consider an adoption call, or what's the next step for us?
Miriam, adoption call next week.
Serge is breaking up a little bit for me. Is that just me?
I think we do an adoption call next week on the mailing list.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Miriam. Thanks much.
Thank you, everybody.
Charles, hi. I think you're up next. Let me know if you can see if you can get your slides loaded. Otherwise, I can help.
Yeah, it's taking a while to. But yeah, I see the option now. Okay, I can see him here. Do you see him? Great. All right, so this is about the draft on running an IETF hackathon. Just to give you an update on where we're at with it. So maybe for those of you who this draft might be a little bit new, just a quick recap what the draft is about. It's about running an IETF hackathon, and those are to encourage the IETF community to come together to collaborate on code and code that's related to the work we're doing in the IETF around, the drafts that we're working on. And this document is to provide some practices around how to run those IETF hackathons. The hackathons started out as the IETF meetings, as in-person events, but we've always had remote participation, very similar to IETF meetings in general. And then because of the pandemic, we had to adapt to running hackathons online only. So this draft covers both, as opposed to what you just saw with the previous draft, which is really focusing on online only. This draft covers both all aspects of the hackathon, whether it's in person or online only, and also to that extent the hybrid aspect, because basically all hackathons have always been hybrid, but maybe we'll add a little bit more about that. So we started working group last call after the last IETF meeting, and thanks to those who reviewed, and then there was a lot of good feedback, mostly positive. Actually, I think all positive. However, pointing out some issues that could be raised. And so what I did for tracking these was I entered them all as issues in GitHub, and then started working through them there. And basically, sorry, let me go back. All those were resolved, and then a new version of the draft was produced. Unfortunately, I couldn't get that done in time for the deadline for submitting drafts for this IETF meeting, but I just posted it a few days ago. Hopefully you saw that on the list, even if you haven't had a chance to review it yet. I'd appreciate it if you would take a look. I know I worked with all the submitters of the issues to make sure that this draft resolved their concerns. But then what I want to do now is just run over a few things which were a little bit more substantial changes, just to bring them to everyone's attention and provide that opportunity for additional feedback. So the first thing was around something new that's been developed really as a result of the pandemic. And that's what we refer to as HackNet. And this is for remote networking, so that when you're online here, you can still connect to an IETF network or a virtual IETF network. And that's really important for the hackathon, or at least some hackathon projects that really need that idea of like connecting everyone in the group, connecting their devices, together on a common layer 2 network. So HackNet provides that, and that's been a great thing. We certainly plan to continue to use that, even as we return back to in-person meetings, as a way to enable people who are remote to join the IETF network. And so I had documented that before, but the concern was that this is still very experimental, and although it's worked great, and I think we've enjoyed using it for the hackathon, the NOC folks who are supporting it mentioned like, hey, we want everyone to know that this is still an experimental thing. So text to that effect has been added into the draft, just to set expectations around it. Okay, I'll move to the next thing. Next thing was around also with HackNet. I think Drew pointed out, well, yeah, HackNet's great, but what about additional security considerations that may come into play as a result of that? We had some considerations around privacy, but nothing around security. And so that was a really good point, and I'm glad Drew raised that. So you can see what we've added here, that yes, it is kind of opening up a new vector for potential attacks and misuse of the IETF network, being able to join remotely. However, we do have some mechanisms in place. Your access is tied to your data tracker account, so at least we know who is accessing. And then, as at any IETF meeting, we always try to keep the IETF network as open as possible. And that probably makes it a little bit more subject to potential attacks. But we also just rely on IETF, the community that's at a meeting to respect the IETF network. And that's actually worked out pretty well for us. But in the event anything did go wrong, we would treat sort of misuse of the IETF network through Hacknet the same as we would if a person at an in-person meeting was misusing the IETF network, and address it that way. And then the last thing, Drew also pointed out that there's a ton of basically links to references, whether they be wiki pages or web pages, things on the internet within the draft. And I had just included these all as inline sort of things using Markdown. And so the thought was, well, hey, these should probably be informative references. So I added an informative reference section, and you can see the way I've gone about doing this. I just basically the text that I had in the draft I made as the title, and then the target is the URL where the things appear. I don't know if I actually did this correctly, and if people in this meeting now take a look and have some thoughts about maybe is this appropriate use of informational references? Is there a better way to go about this? Perhaps I should have done something different with the title. I'd be happy to hear that. I'm also planning on, if I don't get any other feedback, I'll take it to the maybe the tools discussed list, just to let them know, hey, this is what I've done. Did I mess up? Do you have a better idea? So thoughts on that would be appreciated. And the next step, there's just that one thing with the references that I think could use some improving. Other than that, though, I think it's ready to progress the draft. I hope people get a chance to take a look at it and provide review comments. And of course, any feedback now or questions now would be great too.
Charles, and the goal is to ship as fast as possible.
I think you said, Suresh, the goal is to progress this draft as soon as possible, kind of get it done. Is that what you said? That would be my goal. I wasn't sure I heard you right. Kind of the audio cut out for me. Okay. If no one's coming to the queue or has questions, I guess I'm done. That was my last slide. All right. Thanks.
I'm having some audio issues, not sure why. But there is like a recharter text that's almost final, so I'll send a mail to the mailing list to get it kicked off.
Yeah, we heard you okay, Suresh, but it was just a little soft. But yeah, just to reiterate, there is rechartered text. It's going to go to the mailing list.
Cancellation somehow just seems to be off for some reason.
Okay. There's nobody in the queue. Go ahead, Charles.
Yeah, so regarding the rechartering text, I had a look at it, and it seemed like several people did review it there within the Google Doc. But in terms of the next step, do we think it's ready? That this group needs to review it more, or is it like ready to take it as a proposed recharter to the IESG, or I wasn't quite clear on if you're looking for more feedback and how.
Yeah, good question. Good question. It means there's an echo for me, but I'm just going to mute you. I think this was Suresh and I took all the changes people had put in before. We created a new draft version, but it's worth folks commenting on the list before it goes for a final recharter. But so yeah, look out for it on the list, but I think it's actually in really good shape. There's no outstanding questions that I can think to present to you right now about it. So yeah, Suresh is going to email the list. You can put yourself back.
Oh, okay. I was happy with the text that was in there. The one thing I thought about was I didn't know if we wanted to call out specific sort of deliverables or drafts that we think it does provide, like the types of drafts, or the types of things that need to be covered. But maybe if that was the only thing I thought of, is if we wanted to add a little more specificity around that.
I recall that being there, so I don't know if you have specific suggestions around specific additions.
Okay, maybe was it like, okay, I'll take a look again. I didn't remember seeing that, but okay.
It was there before, and I don't think we removed it. So,
okay.
But maybe your level of specificity is different, which is why proposed changes would be fine.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, Miria.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we should just use the time and bring the charter up on the screen and talk a little bit about the things that have changed from the previous charter, so everybody's on board.
Yeah, we could do that.
I've done a tip exactly for that media, and I'll ship it up to the list, right? Like, it's kind of hard to go through. So there's 3 classes of changes in there. So one of them is to remove the COVID-related stuff and make it a bit more general. And the second thing is adding hybrid meetings in scope. And third thing is really changing the meeting feed draft into a BCP.
Charles or Miria, are you back in the queue because you want to speak? You can just go off mic. You can go on mic and. Thanks for dropping the link in the chat. Go ahead.
I'm looking at the text now. I'm actually wondering if what Ted proposed earlier is more a high level recommendation, which is somehow related to tooling, but probably not, just like how to incentivize more socializing, for example, if that would still be in scope or not. Because we have this one point about planning fully online meetings, but that point is mostly focusing on scheduling aspects. So I guess it's either a question to the chairs and the idea if that would be in scope, or a proposal that we add like a small thing there as well.
I think it's okay to be ambiguous. If it's not obviously out of scope, then I don't feel like we need to make a change. And if it's something that we feel is important, and I think if somebody wanted to write that down, I know Ted was saying explicitly he doesn't have the time to do it, but if someone feels strongly enough about writing something about social interaction, then if it isn't explicitly out of scope with this charter, I think that's a good thing. It means that there can be some experimentation and suggestions around that. That's how I feel. But if we put it in the charter explicitly, then does it feel like an imperative to address the social? I don't know.
Maybe just to add to that, I think for me it probably would also be hard to put something in without actually seeing a draft and understanding what the draft would be saying.
Indeed, I agree with that. Okay, I'm just rounding out notes. I encourage everybody who's spoken today. I didn't capture a lot of the discussion in the chat in the notes, but I think for the most part, they're thorough. So, but you can go ahead and check them, make changes before we finalize. And yeah, there's nobody else in the queue, so I think we might be done for today. Okay. Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, just to bring something that I was mentioning in the chat, there was this draft from Elliot Lear, who I think isn't here. We got to stop meeting like this, suggesting that we should, or the LLC or someone should investigate changing the in-person meeting cadence because of the costs of very regular in-person meetings. And I'm just looking at the charter. I certainly think that is in scope, at least under the revised charter, although maybe it's not very emphasized. Like it says that one work item is we'll consider the cadence of mostly in-person meetings. I guess I hope we could like emphasize that or change that more substantially, but it just seems in scope to me. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, it is in scope, I think. And so the ISG, the IB, and the LLC, we discussed this a little bit on a workshop we had, a virtual workshop we had a few weeks ago. And so generally the feeling was that because of COVID and this long string of fully online meetings, it's not actually clear if this is sort of something we want to do right away. In the sense that we are just trying to build back to going to some in-person capability, and immediately thinking about, should we change the cadence and the type of meetings we have now after COVID seemed like something that was very difficult to imagine. The other thing where we are sort of a little all over the place is, what do we think? What would that look like? So would we replace one of the three meetings, or at least one of the three meetings, with a fully online meeting? Would we add fully online meetings to the year? And sort of there were, people that felt that adding meetings would just make the year too busy with too much IETF stuff going on, especially since there's also interim meetings. Replacing one of the three with a fully online meeting, the feeling was that, which one and why, and they're already sort of rare enough that spacing them out further would be maybe difficult to do. But so we were sort of basically decided to punt this forward and worry about this as we sort of ramp back up from COVID. But all that said, right, if the community wants to discuss this, it's certainly in scope, and I think if there would be some sort of consensus, or at least an indication of consensus expressed, I think that might be helpful. But in the ISG and IAB and LLC, we didn't have that when we discussed this.
That's useful context, thanks. I think it's an ideal time to consider it. I think we have an opportunity now that remote people aren't second-class citizens because we've all had to be. Like, this is an opportunity to not go back to, okay, well, let's make them second-class citizens again for a few years, and then we can talk about switching. I'd rather we just not go back to second-class citizenship.
Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick comment. So, one observation from the last couple of years, I think, has underlined why, for those people that are lucky enough to be able to participate in person, why that's important and does make a big difference. Notwithstanding improving the remote experience, I think there's a lot of learnings from the last 2 years, which mean that going forward, the remote experience could and should be a lot better than perhaps it was previously. And then, as a quick aside, without going too far off into other matters, for those people more concerned about the carbon footprint of in-person, in my opinion, I think the community will be better off looking at the carbon footprint of its protocols and protocol changes, which probably have a far more significant impact on the world's sort of carbon footprint than a few people attending meetings each year. But that probably is a whole different conversation than the one here. Thanks.
Jay, just if I can, just cut in for a second. And sorry, John, the idea is not to go through it, just to kind of show you it's an extensive change in the charter. I did send the link to the, it's in the chat. So if you can go in and click on it, just go ahead and look at it at your leisure. This is not to finalize it today. So sorry about that. I just want to, I think somebody proposed to bring it up and take a look. I think it was Miria. So I just brought it up, right? But yeah, absolutely. The idea is not to litigate this now, because it doesn't make sense to do it online on this. So we had probably a month of open period, where people could go and comment, and a lot of people did. So we can probably have some small cool off period before we ship it off to Lars. I would say, would a week be good enough for you, Lars, to set off as a cooling period so people can fight their IETF fatigue and then work on it next week?
Yeah, that would be fine for me. So this is basically for the working group to decide when they have text that they consider stable, and then I'll stick it in the data tracker and start the formal thing.
Yeah, sounds good. So thank you very much. Jay, please go ahead.
Thanks. So on this question of regularly meeting offline, online, not in person, a few things. So what data we have shows that people strongly prefer meeting in person and are experiencing adverse effects from not meeting in person. So whenever we do a survey after one of the fully online meetings, it's full of comments from people lamenting the fact that they're not meeting in person. Secondly, it's not actually more expensive for us to run an on-site one compared to an in-person one, because they're both relatively cost neutral. Obviously, it's more expensive for attendees and for sponsors. The sponsors are quite comfortable with that, and I suspect the attendees by and large are. Next thing is we've started doing carbon calculations for on-site meetings, in-person meetings, the last time we had one, and we have a process set up to do that again when we go back to that. And we've started looking at carbon credits, or carbon offsetting anyway. We haven't done anything about that because we haven't been expecting to meet in person for quite some time, but it looks as though that's perfectly possible for us to do within the cost of a meeting, to do carbon offsetting. Now, obviously, that's not as good as not traveling in the first place, but it's something a bit better. And then finally, the bit about being second class. So a lot of work is going in to try to prevent the remote experience being second class compared to the in-person on-site experience. So that's through the technology. So we have a new version of Meet Echo coming, which anyway, they're various things going on there that we're aiming to do to try to adjust that, such as a single queue, for example, and those things. Obviously, a lot of that comes down to the behaviour of people within who are on site, as to how they are willing to accommodate people who are off site. So we can only solve some of it with technology, but it's aiming to do that. And of course, the other problem is time zones that we have to decide when we go back to these if we're still going to have a 6-hour meeting or if we can go back to an 8 or 9-hour meeting, because that would be much more difficult for remote participants. So there are, as I said, basically there are a lot of reasons why people want to meet again in person, and a lot of work taking place to mitigate the impact of meeting in person. Thanks.
Lars, like you were in queue, like, did you want to say something related to this, or
I
did you
think
want
Jay said what I wanted to say.
Okay, thank you. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that, yes, I do want to meet in person. I don't necessarily want to meet in person more than once a year. And, you know, well, my kids will be in college very soon. One's already there. When my kids were younger, doing 3 meetings a year well, I never did it, actually. I never did more than 2 meetings a year. The other thing that I mean, we assume that the IETF meeting structure really works at all. I think it obviously doesn't, because to participate meaningfully in any working group meeting, you have to read the drafts. Over an IETF week, I usually do at least 12 working groups. Reading the drafts for 12 working groups is in itself a huge undertaking, which I could only do because I was permanent research staff. I don't think that most people can do that. And I don't think that the IETF meeting structure really relates to how I would want to do work as an engineer if I designed the process from scratch. Finally, on the carbon offsets thing, the reason that you make a symbolic gesture on carbon emissions is to remind yourself that it's important. So it's not, I mean, we've never talked about the carbon cost of our protocols before. The reason for starting to making a symbolic gesture in terms of how we do our own work is to remind ourselves that that is important. That said, if you look at the aviation fuel is mostly kerosene. If you look at the consumption of kerosene globally, it turns out that over half of it goes into lighting, kerosene lanterns. It's expensive, it's dangerous, it's poor lighting. If we just gave everybody LED lamps and solar panels, we could do that within 5 years, and we wouldn't need to change. We would have the same effect of converting every jet. So offsets are the way to go, but it's complicated. Anyway, just want to say that.
Thanks, Phil. I think like one of the things that you brought up, right, it's kind of a bit relevant here. And I don't know if that's what you meant, Phil, but like, you know, you said this is not how you want to work. I think some people have suggested like a whole bunch of interims is the way to go, right? And that could probably help with your like read too many drafts thing if it's like offset in time. But there was a proposal, I think, from Michael and Miria that's incorporated into the charter. Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Thanks.
Yeah, I mentioned this in the chat, but you know, certainly looking at the in-person meeting cost of the carbon, I mean, how do you factor in the benefit that the work we do at the IETF, right? I mean, we empower a lot of remote work, right? There's a huge, I think, multiplicative benefit from what we do. So even though we might burn some carbon getting in person, if we work really effectively, the benefit and the reduction of carbon across the globe, you know, from remote work and things like that, I think it's probably multiplicative, right? And so I don't think we should get into counting numbers too much in that particular sense. And to what Phil said, he did say I a few times, but there were a few like things he said that were like sort of statements about IETF. I mean, I find IETF very effective 3 times a year, right? So, I mean, I guess you have to balance that, right? Some people it works, some people it doesn't.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thank you. Jay, go ahead. Elliot, go ahead. If Jay comes back, we'll go ahead.
Hi, everybody.
Elliot.
Well, hey, Suresh, and I can see that Christian's doing his part because he, in terms of saving carbon, because he clearly doesn't have the heat on in his house. He's got that jacket on. Well, it's been quite a while since I published draft. We got to start meeting like we got to stop meeting like this. If ever there was a draft that was overtaken by events, that was the one. Just a couple of brief comments and I'll move on. First of all, thank you, Jay. Thank you very much, Jay, for collecting the information. The draft that I wrote was not intended to be prescriptive in terms of any particular solution, but rather for us to ponder our footprint on the planet, and to maybe consider getting us out of the mode of where we book 5 to 7 years in advance, where it's almost impossible to run an experiment in terms of how we might restructure things, but to get us into better position where we could try different modes of communication and collaboration. So now that I'm not even sure we can say we're seeing the end, the light at the end of the tunnel yet. Here in Europe, the numbers are spiking again. But assuming that day comes, my suggestion is we go back to this notion of trying a few different things and seeing what works. I don't really want to sacrifice effectiveness either. I can tell you from my own personal experience, I'm sure everybody's different here, but I don't feel as effective when I'm jet lagged. So it could be that the costs are, it's very hard to account for all of these costs, but the cost that I primarily wanted to account for was the one that my kid was sort of, buttoning me with and saying, hey, you're becoming the problem in terms of carbon footprint. So that is one of the issues that I think is important, and to the point that, oh yeah, well, there's obviously a benefit of us getting together and meeting and being productive. I'd be a little nervous about using that line, because I think everybody would end up using it, saying, oh, we're always benefiting the world by meeting. And we're social people, so we like to meet. So the trick is to find the right balance. Anyway, thanks for your patience, and wish everybody a great day.
Thank you, Elliot. Lars, did you want to chime in there?
Hey, yeah, I was sort of want to, that was all great, Elliot, but I sort of wonder if you wanted to, or if you had a concrete change in mind that we sort of, you think sort of we should do, or that you think we could get consensus on, because that's sort of where, this is sort of the step that I struggle with, right? Sort of, to go from the abstract to sort of a concrete thing that we actually believe we can do, because I think the community is sort of a little bit all over the place here.
Okay. Well, thanks for the question, Lars. Very classically, the question, I'm used to you asking that question at this point, so I actually have a couple of concrete suggestions. I'm going to go from a little bit abstract then into the concrete. At the abstract level, I think we should collect a number of possible approaches that we could try. And when I say try, I mean not standardize on in terms of this is the way things will go in the future, but I do mean try. We don't have to try them every year, but maybe we plan out a schedule of how we try things. So what does that mean concretely? I'll give you a couple of examples that we could try. The one that I like is going to semi-annual meetings to try for plenary purposes, and then load up with lots of interims, and further in that period of time require that the interims not be in person. In doing that, there are a couple of variants on that. One variant is instead of running a meeting for when we do the semi-annual, instead of running the meeting for, and this is where things get a little interesting, is how you calculate the beginning and the end of an IETF meeting, but extend the meetings on either side by a couple of days. That would be one example of trying. Another thing to try would be to do semi-annual meetings again.
Can I actually ask you a clarification question on the first one? So you're saying basically we should go to a semi-annual sort of plenary, but make it like 1.5 weeks or something, or 2 weeks? Or?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, another approach is to do a similar semi-annual activity, but require blocks, if you will, of interim meetings that occur in person on the bookends. So if we're meeting in, say, I'll just pick 2 dates. If we're meeting in, say, March and November, then require interim blocks in, say, July and December or something like that. Maybe even it out a little bit so that it's a little bit more symmetrical. So that would be another approach to try. And I don't have a particularly strong, direction to say, let's do this first or let's do that first. But what I would like to do before we do any of them is at least do a calculation, a rough sketch calculation as to which we think will have the most beneficial impact in terms of the environment, so we have some understanding. Because the last thing I'd like to do is try something that makes things worse for the environment, and we could absolutely do that. I don't put it beyond us to do that by accident. That's one approach. A third try, by the way, would be to go annual meetings and make them make them for 2 weeks in length, but do a lot more interims. I think that may be too radical for the community, to be honest. I think it's already pretty radical to swallow the idea of going semi-annual. So those are just a couple of ideas. But again, I didn't mean to be at all prescriptive, right? These are just some things we could evaluate. And the intent that I had of asking Jay to get the data and ask the LLC to get the data was to help us calculate these things in terms of what would be beneficial, and then present that back to the community as options of things to try. What I think is most important in the process, though, is to make sure from a contractual standpoint that the LLC sees that we're interested in doing these tries, and thus allows for, at a contractual level, us to be able to manage the hotels and things like that. And I don't want to discount the effort that's involved in that. I'm sure that's a substantial challenge. All right, thanks again.
Thanks, Elliot. I think Jan, you're next.
Thank you. We can have all sorts of opinions about what is best for the environment and the planet and so on. But a real fact of life for me is that my employer, Cisco, has announced that they will be cutting travel expenses by 60% going out of COVID. And I heard Ericsson say similar things from the CEO. So no matter what I think, it will not be possible for me to attend in person, at least not in transcontinental venues. So it would be really nice if we could have no second level citizenship in the meetings if we are remote. I don't think we need to change all that much. We can have as many meetings as you want and so on, but make sure that everybody who wants to participate remotely can do so in a good way. I don't want to be second rate. Thank you.
Thanks, yeah. Thank you. Charles?
Okay. Yeah, I think one of the things that's become clear through a lot of our discussions is that the way people interact with the IETF really varies quite a lot. And the people on this call are probably people who interact with the IETF a bit, say, more intensely than people who perhaps aren't on this call. But I think we need to keep in mind that there's that spectrum. We heard from PHP how even just within his time working within the IETF, how he participates has changed and his level of participation has changed. And so to me, the real thing for us to focus on would be the hybrid approach and looking to see, let's keep the remote participation and let's continue to make improvements in how, when you do attend the meeting remotely, that experience is good. And I think what you'll find quite naturally as a result of that is you will have more remote attendees, that people will, you always make that trade-off. Do I travel to the meeting or do I attend remotely or do I not go at all, right? We all make that decision, or we have for a number of years before COVID, and even with COVID, how much time do I devote to it? But I think what you'll start to see is if the remote experience is good, people will tend to use that a little bit more, a little tip to where, okay, I can't or I don't want to travel. There's only these few things I can do them remotely. I don't need to be there. We'll enable that decision, or we'll make people more likely to make that decision. And we'll improve the overall experience for everyone if we do it carefully. I think what we need to watch out for is that we don't mess up and everyone feels like they need to be at the in-person meeting, or else, because remote's useless. Or alternatively, we make the in-person meeting so bad because we optimize for remote experience that no one shows up. And then we say like, oh, we'll just meet online, because we know that's not ideal either. So really trying to find that sweet spot with these experiments people have been mentioning. I think that's great. I'd like to see us go forward with that. And then maybe after that, give that a little bit of time, let's see some of the benefits of that and where we end up. And then we could probably also meet, in person less often if the whole hybrid experience or remote, attendance thing continues to get better as it has. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. Andrew?
Hi, just picking up on the sort of discussion on move to more interims. As an observation, I think if the IETF was to become much more interim sort of based, that feels to me very divisive for the community. And so it depends whether you think the IETF is a community or not. So for some people that may not be a consideration. But if you like, by putting much more stuff into very discrete silos, then you lose the perspectives from people that perhaps aren't focused on solving a particular problem, but can bring a unique perspective to it because they happen to be on site with a spare slot, so drop in. And I think that's less likely to happen if we've got a huge spread of interims. I'd also worry that it will be harmful for diversity if there's a much greater use of interims, because they tend, and this is a generalism, but I think if you look at the data, it would be broadly supportive of this, to be scheduled for the convenience of people currently involved in a particular working group. So it makes it potentially a lot harder unintentionally for people in other places to participate effectively and frequently. So dare I say, if one thing we might want to consider is, should some of the time zone guidelines that on the paper that we started this meeting with apply to interims? Should they be required to rotate time zones? Should they be required to use better tooling, so that the remote experience of interims is both consistent and better? Maybe that would be a good use of some time and some expertise, because I think at the moment my impression is they're pretty ad hoc in how they're arranged. I mean, I know there are some rules around you have to give two weeks notice, etc., but other than that, they're left a lot to the sort of devices of the individual working group. So perhaps there will be benefit from that being regularized, but I'd go back to my original point. Nevertheless, if there's to be an IETF community as opposed to a working group community, then there would be implications in putting a lot more emphasis on those rather than the sort of IETF sort of meetings as they're currently structured. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Martin?
Thanks. Three points that are in response to the things that have been moving through the discourse here. I would like to unpack the second class experience comment. So, like, personally, it was only 3 or 4 years ago that I was a regular remote attendee, and having been a remote attendee under the old regime and a in-person attendee, and now this new kind of remote attendee thing, I would say like the real difference is that in the first case, I was not really participating in the side conversations for reasons that are obvious. Most people would agree the side conversations are extremely valuable, and I am not prepared to kind of kneecap the productivity of IETF in an effort to ensure equality by just degrading the value, by eliminating this really valuable process because some people can't attend it. Secondly, there's been a talk about like more strict corporate travel rules. Obviously, if people don't want to come to meetings anymore, we're going to stop having them. But to the extent that companies are limiting travel to within their continent, that is actually a case to continue to meeting 3 times in person per year, because then at least you could get the productivity of in person once per year. That's why we rotate to a large extent. And then finally, about interims. Look, I was a big participant in Quick. The interims were amazing, but IETF 107 was at least it was an emergency situation, but we went to a very interim-heavy model. And while you can poke at the exact details of implementation there, we essentially had a month of meetings at about 1,700 UTC. I did not find that to be a particularly good model. And like you can tweak the details, and maybe there's like one magic formula for interims that would work really well, but that seemed to be really onerous on people's schedules, and also, as Andrew was suggesting, not very inclusive in terms of time zones. Like, it always falls into that Atlantic optimized time zone. So like I said, interims are good. Some working groups it really works, but I'm really reluctant to just kind of drive a lot of working groups to be forced into that mode. Thanks.
Thank you. Andrew, did you have another comment, or are you lingering around from the previous time you were just speaking? Okay. So I did have a comment to make on this. And so this is something I just observed, like interims work for some set of people and some set of working groups, but they don't work for others. Like, I think when Michael was talking about stuff working pretty well, right? Like the IoT cluster in the IETF, it's almost like a mini IETF. So like people kind of all hang out together, and they do attend like working groups across multiple areas, so things become easier. Like so for example, like core and then like role and LP WAN and all those things are like kind of like pretty well integrated, like technology wise, they all work together. So it becomes a little bit easier to follow those things. So I do see, like, the both sides of the argument here, but I think the real answer is it really depends. Like some groups just get along well with interims and some don't, and we just need to make sure that like different needs are accommodated by whatever we end up doing. So thank you. I think Miria, you're up next.
Yeah, I'm up again because this point about interim is actually something that we touched in the draft we discussed earlier. And so first of all, I want to make a point that interims and the kind of meeting that you have at this IETF week are usually have not the same dynamics. They kind of work very differently, and that's also why they might work differently well for different groups, and they can achieve different goals. So I just encourage chairs to use like both of these things. In interims, it's much better to have like a small group, deep technical discussion, which is very interactive, while in the meeting week, you have much more people who are not that frequently reading the mailing list or coming to the meetings and can provide a different kind of feedback. And so you should also organize your meeting to accomplish these kind of things. And so what I would like to encourage chairs is like to use both of these meeting forms appropriately, and also consider if you always need to meet at the IETF meeting, or if you are in a phase with your working group where maybe interims are more effective for you. For example, at the beginning of a working group, it does make sense to have these meetings in the meeting week because you want to have other people have a look. But when you're like close to the end and you're just rushing through the issues, maybe interims are more appropriate. So there is a little bit of discussion in the draft. And the draft basically says it really depends on the chairs how they want to organize it. But if people want to add more text about that, I'm happy to take text proposals for the draft.
Thank you, Miria. Thank you very much. I don't see anybody in the queue, and we're almost out of time. So I'll just give like a couple of seconds for people to like come up to the queue if they want. Otherwise, we'll just wrap. Going once, twice, and thrice. So thank you very much, folks. This has been like a fantastic meeting. Thank you very much. And please do comment on the charter, and like we'll keep it open for at least the next week for the re-charter proposal, and then we ship it off to Lars. Of course, it's like still going to be open for comment after, because like a bunch of other people are going to be seeing it. But really try to get in your comments into the charter before that if you can, but otherwise we'll ship it off to Lars and we can handle it after. Thank you very much, and have a nice day, early morning, evening, night, wherever you are, and especially like the people in Australia, like, who are having a really long day. Thank you very much. Thanks. And New Zealand as well, like in case there's somebody there. Thanks.